The harbor smelled of diesel and death. Sergeant Takeshi Moriyama stood on the wooden dock at Rabaul, watching his men climb the gangway onto the transport ship Tio Maru. Nobody spoke. Nobody asked where they were going. In the Imperial Japanese Army, questions were not permitted. Orders were absolute. And tonight's orders were simple: board the ships, cross the sea, reinforce the garrison at La. What the orders did not mention was that American reconnaissance planes had been circling for 3 days. What the orders did not mention was that the convoy would sail through 800 kilometers of open water with almost no air cover. What the orders did not mention was that half of them would never reach the other side. That it was March 1, 1943. The war in the Pacific had turned against Japan. Guadalcanal had fallen 2 weeks earlier. The American forces were pushing north through the Solomon Islands, island by island, airfield by airfield. New Guinea had become the new front line. The garrison at La was starving, running low on ammunition, desperately waiting for reinforcements. Imperial headquarters in Tokyo had ordered Operation 81, a massive convoy of 20 transport ships carrying nearly 7,000 soldiers of the 51st Division. 8 destroyers would escort them. A handful of Zero fighters would provide air cover when possible. It was not enough. Everyone knew it was not enough. But the orders had come from Tokyo, and Tokyo did not accept failure. Moriyama was 24 years old. He had survived the hell of Guadalcanal, where American Marines had fought like demons and Japanese soldiers had died by the thousands from bullets, disease, and starvation. He had learned things on that island that the training manuals never taught. He had learned that courage meant nothing against superior firepower. He had learned that the enemy's planes owned the sky, and whoever owned the sky owned the battlefield. He had learned that orders from headquarters often came from men who had never heard a bullet pass their ears. Now he was being sent across another stretch of ocean, into another trap, and there was nothing he could do except make sure his men died with some small measure of dignity. Below deck, the transport ship was a nightmare of human bodies. 600 soldiers packed into a space meant for 200. Men sat shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches, their rifles between their knees, their packs crushing against their backs. The air was thick with sweat and fear and the sour smell of seasickness. There were no portholes. No ventilation. Just the constant groan of the ship's hull and the distant rumble of engines. Private First Class Yoichi Sato, the youngest man in Moriyama's squad, sat in the corner with his eyes closed. He was 19 years old. He had never been in combat. He kept a photograph of a girl from Nagasaki in his helmet, a girl he had seen once at a train station and never spoken to. He had written her name on the back of the photograph as if writing it would make her real, would make the future real, would make survival possible. Moriyama moved through the hold, checking on his men. He did not give speeches about honor or duty or the emperor. Those words meant nothing down here in the darkness. Instead, he told them practical things. He told them where the life vests were stored. He told them to stay close to the ladders. He told them that if the ship was hit, they should not panic, should not push, should climb steadily toward the deck. When Sato opened his eyes and asked if they would make it to La, Moriyama paused. He looked at the boy's face, so young, so desperate for reassurance, and he did something he had never done before. He lied. "We will make it," he said. "The Navy will protect us. Just stay calm and follow orders." The words tasted like ash in his mouth. At midnight, the convoy slipped out of Rabaul harbor. 20 transport ships in a long column, 8 destroyers spread around them like nervous dogs guarding a flock of sheep. The night was clear. Too clear. The stars burned bright against the black sky, and the moon cast silver light across the water. Good weather for sailing. Terrible weather for hiding. Moriyama climbed to the deck and stood at the railing, watching the harbor lights fade into the distance. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, American planes were waiting. American pilots were studying maps and checking their bombs and talking about skip bombing techniques that could sink a ship with a single hit. Somewhere out there, death was patient. The convoy would take 3 days to reach La. Moriyama did not believe they had 3 days. He did not believe they had 2. He stood at the railing until the cold wind numbed his face, until Rabaul was nothing but a memory, until the only light came from the stars above and the faint glow of the ship's wake below. Then he went back down to the hold, back to his men, back to the waiting darkness. The war had taught him many things, but it had never taught him how to save the men who trusted him. It had only taught him how to watch them die. The reconnaissance photograph hit the table like a death sentence. Captain William Brennan leaned forward, studying the grainy black and white image, 20 ships crawling across the Bismarck Sea like insects on glass. Troop transports. Destroyers. Nearly 7,000 Japanese soldiers packed into those hulls, heading for La to reinforce the enemy garrison. If they reached New Guinea, the war in the Pacific would drag on for months, maybe years. If they reached New Guinea, more American boys would die in the jungle. The intelligence officer circled the convoy with a red grease pencil and said the words that every pilot in the room already knew, "Gentlemen, these ships cannot reach La." It was March 2, 1943, and Port Moresby was the most dangerous airfield in the world. Nestled on the southern coast of New Guinea, surrounded by mountains and jungle, it served as the launching point for Allied operations against Japanese positions throughout the region. The base was primitive, dirt runways, canvas tents, mosquitoes thick enough to choke on. Malaria killed almost as many men as the enemy. But the pilots who flew from Port Moresby were some of the most skilled and desperate in the Pacific theater. They had learned to fight outnumbered. They had learned to improvise. And they had learned a new technique that would change naval warfare forever. Skip bombing. The idea was simple but terrifying. Instead of dropping bombs from high altitude, where wind and distance made accuracy nearly impossible, pilots would fly their B-25 bombers at 90 feet above the water, release their bombs at close range, and let them skip across the surface like stones on a pond. The bombs would bounce once, twice, 3 times, then slam into the ship's hull at the waterline, exactly where the armor was thinnest. It was devastatingly effective. It was also suicidal. Flying a bomber at 90 feet meant threading through anti-aircraft fire at point-blank range. One mistake, one lucky shot from a Japanese gunner, and the plane would cartwheel into the sea. No parachutes. No second chances. Brennan was 28 years old, a former crop duster from Illinois who had joined the Army Air Forces 3 days after Pearl Harbor. His brother had died on the Arizona, trapped below deck when the battleship exploded, drowned in burning oil. Brennan had spent 2 years training for revenge. He had practiced skip bombing until he could put a 500-pound bomb through a target the size of a barn door. He had studied Japanese ship designs, memorized the weak points, calculated the angles. Now the convoy was coming, and he was ready, but the weather was wrong. March 2 brought heavy clouds over the Bismarck Sea, shielding the convoy from attack. A few high-altitude bombers made runs through the overcast, dropping their payloads blind, hitting nothing. The convoy kept moving. 60 miles closer to La. Then 80. Then 100. Every hour of delay was another hour of safety for the Japanese, another hour of growing frustration for the Allied pilots stuck on the ground. Brennan stood at the edge of the runway, watching the clouds, willing them to break. They did not break. That night, Flight Lieutenant Thomas Marsh sat alone in his tent, cleaning his Beaufighters' guns. Marsh was Australian, a quiet, sunburned man with steady hands and empty eyes. His job was to lead the strafing runs. Before the bombers went in, the Beaufighters would dive on the convoy and rake the decks with machine gun fire, killing the anti-aircraft gunners, suppressing the defenses, giving the B-25s a chance to make their bombing runs without being blown out of the sky. It was precise, mechanical work. It was also murder. The men on those decks were human beings, soldiers following orders, just like him. Marsh tried not to think about it. He focused on the guns, on the ammunition belts, on the technical details that kept his mind occupied. A young mechanic asked what it felt like to strafe men in the water. Marsh did not answer. At 0400 on March 3, the weather report came in. The cold front was clearing. The clouds were breaking up. By dawn, the Bismarck Sea would be naked under a bright Pacific sun. Brennan gathered his crew and walked to his beat 25. The engines coughed to life. The propellers spun. Across Port Moresby, dozens of aircraft were warming up, bombers, fighters, Beaufighters, a strike force unlike anything the Japanese had ever faced. Brennan taxied to the runway and waited for the signal. The mountains to the east were turning pink with the first light of dawn. Somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, 3,000 men were sailing toward their deaths. They just did not know it yet. The first bomb hit the Kyokusei Maru at exactly 10 a.m., and the world ended. Sergeant Moriyama felt the shockwave before he heard the explosion, a violent shudder that threw him against the bulkhead and sent men tumbling across the hold like broken dolls. The lights went out. Emergency sirens screamed. Someone was shouting that they had been hit, that water was coming in, that everyone needed to get above deck immediately. Moriyama grabbed Private Sato by the collar and dragged him toward the ladder. Around them, 600 soldiers fought for the same exit, clawing and pushing and trampling each other in the darkness. The ship groaned like a dying animal. The angle of the floor was changing. They were already listing, above deck, the sky was full of death. Australian Beaufighters came in first, wave after wave of twin-engine fighters diving at the convoy, their nose-mounted cannons blazing. Tracers ripped across the water. Bullets punched through steel. Anti-aircraft gunners on the transport ships fired back wildly, desperately, but the Beaufighters were too fast, too low, too many. A gunner on the Tio Maru managed to track one of the Australian planes, leading it perfectly, squeezing the trigger at exactly the right moment. The Beaufighter exploded in a ball of orange fire and plunged into the sea. But there were 20 more behind it. And behind them came the bombers. Captain Brennan brought his beat 25 down to 90 feet above the waves. At this altitude, the ocean was a blur of blue and white, so close he could taste the salt spray on his lips. The convoy spread out before him, transport ships in a ragged column, destroyers circling frantically, black smoke rising from ships already hit. His bombardier, Sergeant Ray DeLuca, crouched over his sight, calling out the distance. 400 yards. 300. 200. Now, DeLuca said, and Brennan felt the aircraft lift as the 500-pound bomb dropped from the bay. He pulled up hard, banking left, and looked back over his shoulder just in time to see the bomb skip once, twice, 3 times across the water before slamming into the hull of the Oigawa Maru at the waterline. The ship split open like a rotten fruit. Fire erupted from the wound. Within minutes, she was going down. The attack lasted 4 hours. Wave after wave of Allied aircraft pounded the convoy with bombs, bullets, and rockets. The skip bombing technique proved devastatingly effective. Bombs that would have missed from high altitude now struck with surgical precision. The transport Tio Maru took 2 hits and began to sink. The Io Maru caught fire from stem to stern. The Shernai Maru rolled over and went down in less than 3 minutes, trapping hundreds of soldiers below deck. Destroyers raced between the dying ships, trying to rescue survivors, but the planes kept coming. There was no pause. No mercy. No escape. Moriyama found himself in the water. He did not remember jumping. One moment he was on the listing deck of the Tio Maru, the next he was swimming through a sea of oil and debris. The water was cold, colder than he expected. Bodies floated around him, some dead, some dying, some screaming for help that would never come. He grabbed a piece of wooden wreckage and held on. Sato had been beside him on the deck. Where was Sato? He called the boy's name, but the roar of aircraft engines drowned out everything. A Beaufighter passed overhead, so low that Moriyama could see the pilot's face through the cockpit glass. For one frozen moment, their eyes met. Then the plane banked away, searching for other targets, and Moriyama was a lone dot on the destroyer Shikanami. Lieutenant Commander Endo made an impossible choice. His ship was one of the last escorts still operational. Hundreds of soldiers were drowning in the water around him, men from the 51st Division, men who had trusted the Navy to protect them. Endo ordered his crew to stop engines and begin rescue operations, knowing that a stationary ship was a perfect target. For 20 minutes, sailors pulled survivors from the oil-slicked sea while aircraft circled overhead. Endo stood on the bridge, watching the sky, waiting for the bomb that would end his life. The bomb never came. The American and Australian pilots did not attack the rescue ships. He did not understand why. Perhaps they had run out of ammunition. Perhaps they had some code of honor he did not know. Perhaps they simply could not bring themselves to kill men who were already drowning. Whatever the reason, Endo survived. Most of the convoy did not WWII sunset on March 3. 12 transport ships had been sunk. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. The reinforcements for WWII would never arrive. 26 hours. That is how long Sergeant Takashi Moriyama floated in the Bismarck Sea, clinging to a piece of wreckage that had once been part of the Tio Maru's deck. 26 hours of cold water and burning sun, of oil-slicked waves and circling sharks, of watching men around him slip beneath the surface one by one until he was alone with the bodies and the silence. When the destroyer Uranimi finally pulled him from the water, his hands were burned black from the fuel oil, his lips were cracked and bleeding, and his legs had stopped working entirely. He was one of approximately 800 survivors from a convoy that had carried nearly 7,000 men. The others, more than 3,000 soldiers, were gone. Swallowed by the sea. Erased. Did I end the hospital ship returning to Rabaul? Moriyama asked about his squad. The medic looked away and said nothing. He asked about Private Sato. The medic shook his head. Later, when Moriyama was strong enough to walk, he went through the survivor lists posted on the bulletin board. He found the names of men from other units, other ships, other squads. He did not find a single name from his own. They were all dead. Every last one. The boy with the photograph of the girl from Nagasaki. The corporal who always complained about the food. The private who sang folk songs from his village when he thought no one was listening. All of them gone. All of them feeding the fish in the Bismarck Sea. 1,200 miles away, Captain William Brennan stood in a hangar at Port Moresby, accepting a medal from a general whose name he would not remember. Flashbulbs popped. Officers shook his hand. Someone called the Battle of the Bismarck Sea a turning point in the Pacific War and a masterpiece of tactical aviation. Brennan smiled for the cameras and said the things he was supposed to say. That night, alone in his tent, he tried to write a letter to his mother. He started 3 times and crossed out every sentence. How could he explain what he had seen? How could he describe the ships breaking apart, the men jumping into burning water, the bodies floating in oil slicks that stretched for miles? His brother had died at Pearl Harbor, trapped below deck on the Arizona. For 2 years, Brennan had dreamed of revenge. Now he had it. The taste was bitter. Flight Lieutenant Thomas Marsh stopped flying combat missions. He told his commander that he could no longer strafe ships. He expected a court-martial. Instead, he received a transfer to transport duty, ferrying supplies between rear bases where the war was just a distant rumble. His last combat mission had been March 3, 1943. For the rest of his life, he never spoke about what happened in the Bismarck Sea. When his grandchildren asked about the war, he talked about the food, the weather, the friends he made. He never talked about the faces of the men in the water. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea changed the war in the Pacific. Japan never again attempted to reinforce New Guinea by ship. The skip bombing technique pioneered by the 5th Air Force became standard doctrine, used throughout the Pacific theater until the end of the war. Historians would call it one of the most one-sided air-sea battles in history, a tactical masterpiece that demonstrated the superiority of land-based air power over naval convoys. The numbers were impressive. 12 transport ships sunk. 4 destroyers damaged. 20 aircraft lost. More than 3,000 enemy soldiers killed. On paper, it was a perfect victory, but paper does not remember the things that flesh remembers. Paper does not remember Private Yoichi Sato, 19 years old, who died clutching a photograph of a girl he never met. Paper does not remember Lieutenant Commander Haruki Endo, who watched his convoy die and could not save them. Paper does not remember the pilots who returned to base in silence, who did not celebrate, who sat alone in their cockpits staring at nothing because they understood that killing 3,000 men, even enemy men, even men who would have killed them, leaves a wound that never fully heals. 2 years after the war ended, Moriyama returned to Japan. He married. He had children. He worked in a factory that made automobile parts. He never told his family about the convoy, about the 26 hours in the water, about the men he failed to save. On the anniversary of the battle, every year until he died, he visited a shrine in Osaka and burned incense for the dead. He carried 2 photographs in his wallet, one of his sister, faded but intact, and one of his squad, taken in Rabaul the night before they boarded the ships. In the photograph, they are young and alive and they do not know what is coming. Sato stands in the back row, smiling, the photograph of the Nagasaki girl tucked inside his helmet. Moriyama never prayed for forgiveness at the shrine. He prayed only that his men were no longer cold. The sea keeps what it takes. The survivors carry what the sea leaves behind.